Hello everyone and welcome to Sipz and Storiez. My name is Elizabeth and in today's video I will finally be doing my October Victober wrap up. Again, my apologies for posting this video so late, but I didn't want to move on with nonfiction November until I at least wrapped up Victober and all of these amazing classic books that I read for Victober. I also read a number of witchy middle grade books as well, but I did a separate video for that for Halloween, so I will link my witchy reads video below in case you're at all curious about those books as well, because they were also a lot of fun. But in today's video, I'm going to focus exclusively on the Victorian reads. So grab your favorite beverage as we discuss these amazing books. The first book that I read for Victober was, of course, Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. I mentioned this in my mid-year freakout tag as a book that I wanted to get to this year. I finally did, and I loved it, you guys. Anne Bronte might be my new favorite Bronte sister. I absolutely loved this book. Many people say that this is the first feminist book in all of literature, especially classic literature, that it was very groundbreaking for its time. This book is interesting for people like me that are just fascinated by the Victorians and fascinated by classic literature, because it reminded me that although we love these books, that time period was probably not the greatest time for women in general. It was nice to see women taking a separate role outside of the home, and the Brontes were certainly on the forefront of that. But it reminded me that a lot of women suffered abuse and that it probably went unreported in those days. And I think Anne Bronte was just so brave to write this book and just kind of face the wrath of her sisters, of her family, of the publishers, of just the public in general. A lot of critics did not like this book because it just kind of went against the church and this idea of a virtuous woman, a religious woman, having the courage to leave a marriage and separate from a husband. Very taboo subject at that time. Nowadays it is not, and I'm so grateful for that. It reminds me a lot, if anyone is familiar with books like Daniel Steele and Nora Roberts. I used to grow up with those movies and those books. My mom was a huge Daniel Steele fan, and I just feel like this book is sort of like a classic Daniel Steele about a very smart, beautiful, intelligent woman who just kind of makes a wrong choice, basically, and she kind of has to live with the consequences of that choice. But is it too late to turn your life around just because you made a bad choice? Do you have to follow it through to the end? And I say no. I am just so in love with Anne Bronte now, and I just can't wait to read Agnes Grey now that I've read this. Again, I do love it, and I do think it's a fantastic book. It is now my #2 favorite Bronte novel after Jane Eyre. And again, I really, really like Anne Bronte. I think she is, how I always suspected, the dark horse of the Bronte sisters. She's the one you least hear about, but I feel that she had the most passion and the most courage of the three sisters. And that's especially true in this book. It's also very interesting because Charlotte Bronte did not like this book. Charlotte Bronte really tried after Anne passed away to suppress the second edition of this book. And at first it's kind of a head scratcher, like why would Charlotte Bronte have done that? She was also a very feminist, strong, independent woman. Did she not want to expose Anne? Did she think Anne was too naive to write this book? She wasn't married. She didn't really know what she was talking about. Or I suspect this book was just hit a little too close to home with their brother Bramwell. So a lot of historians have said how Bramwell was a drunkard, a womanizer, very abusive. He spent all the Brontes' money. That was one of the reasons that the sisters all had to become governesses and write books. It wasn't out of just for fun. It was kind of a necessity for them. And in no book does that make more sense and is more clear than when you read Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Even though Anne Bronte was not married herself and she was a single woman, there's no doubt in my mind that she wasn't experienced, that she didn't witness some of these situations in some of the homes that she probably worked in as a governess and some of the schools that she probably worked in, and certainly with her brother Bramwell. They say that Anne Bronte got the brunt of that relationship, and it's very obvious to me that even though Anne Bronte was not married, she did have relationships with narcissists. So this book is about a classic narcissist, Arthur Huntington, and just how it is so difficult to live with a person like that. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. The main character, Helen Huntington, she just has the courage to leave an abusive marriage and an adulterous marriage and basically save herself and save her child. And that is just so groundbreaking. I absolutely love this. I could just ramble on for a long time about this book, but I'll stop there. And I should just say that if you're at all curious, like me, about Tenant of Wildfell Hall, please go back and read it. You will not be disappointed. I really think Anne Bronte was also a genius, just like her sisters, but probably the most understated of all three of them. I love her. The next book that I read for Victober was also a delight, and that was Family Parsonage, which is the fourth book in the Barsetshire Chronicles by Anthony Trollope. I really enjoyed this. I also mentioned this in my mid-year freakout tag and in my Victober tag as Anthony Trollope being my favorite Victorian author. He did not disappoint. Again, this one was a winner. A lot of people had said that Family Parsonage was one of the best in the series, and I have to agree now that I've read it. It features one of my all-time favorite characters, Miss Denstable. I thought Miss Denstable was done in Dr. Thorne, but you guys, she comes back in Family Parsonage and she's better than ever. She is very fierce. If you like Tenant of Wildfell Hall and strong female characters, you will love Miss Denstable. She is the best. But the crux of this story is about a young clergyman named Mark Roberts and his relationship with his very good friend, Lord Lufton. They're kind of roughly the same age, late 20s, early 30s. And Mark kind of gets entangled with this ne'er-do-well character named Mr. Sowerby through Lord Lufton's connections, and Mr. Sowerby asks Mark to guarantee a loan for him, and he does the classic thing like, oh, they'll never come after you, I'll never default on this, I just need your signature. And of course, Mr. Sowerby does default on the loan, and he causes a lot of trouble for Mark and Mark's family, including his sister Lucy, who has fallen madly in love with his best friend, Lord Lufton, and Lord Lufton has fallen in love with her. And just that creates a lot of drama with the family and the Family Parsonage folks as well. Really, really fun story. Some of our other favorite characters in the series make an appearance as well, including Mrs. Prouty, of course. We love her. Archdeacon Grantley and his daughter Griselda. That story is hilarious. And then, of course, some of my favorites like Miss Dunstable, Dr. Thorne, Mary and Frank Gresham. It's really cute to see what Mary and Frank get up to in this book. I absolutely loved it, and again, I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. The way I still sell Trollope to people is that he is cozy intelligent. So if you love books that are just fun and heartwarming, but don't sacrifice on politics and satire and religion and social issues, I highly recommend Trollope because it's just like sinking into a warm hug when you're reading his books, but yet he does keep your mind thinking. That's why I love him so much. The next book that I read for Victober was quite interesting. In fact, I had the most mixed feelings about this book out of all the books I read this month, and that was The Professor by Charlotte Bronte. So again, another book by the Brontes. Tenant of Wildfell Hall was a 5-star read for me. This was hovering around 3 or 4 stars. I cannot believe I didn't like it as much as I thought I was going to. And I think if you have not read Villette yet, I would really steer clear from The Professor because it might turn you off from reading Villette. Basically, Villette was a reworking of The Professor, but instead of a male narrator, William Crimsworth, who is the narrator in this book, Charlotte Bronte reworked it, and she made the book have a female narrator, Lucy Snow. That book, let me just say, is 10 times better than The Professor. The Professor is very, I don't know, like immature, I would say. It's just a different side to Charlotte Bronte's personality. In Villette, her family had passed away, so there's a lot of grief and heartache and depression in Villette. As good as it is, it's just very depressing. Where this, you can tell that she is still young and very ambitious in this book. She's very snarky. Her sense of humor is interesting, very, very judgmental. That being said, because I didn't like the main character, William Crimsworth, I didn't 100% 100% like this book. It's also based on that experience that Charlotte Bronte had in Belgium, where she fell in love with her married professor. And that experience, that relationship really inspired her to write this book, Jane Eyre, Villette, all the greats. That must have been a doozy of a guy to inspire all these great books. This one, though, is about a young man named William, and he is kind of kicked to the curb by his brother in England, and he decides to kind of reinvent himself and go to Belgium as an English teacher in an all-boys boarding school. While William is there, he is also asked to teach part-time at a girls' boarding school, which is right next door. And he kind of gets entangled with the principal of the school. And then he falls for one of the students / teachers, Frances. It's really interesting. However, again, I just didn't like the snarkiness of this book. I thought William himself was extremely judgmental. Just the way that he describes even Frances a little bit, it was like, excuse you, who do you think you are? And then the way he describes a lot of the little girls that go to the school, I was just like, whoa, that's really, really mean. So it leads me to think that, again, because Charlotte Bronte suppressed Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and just the way that she wrote this book, the way that she wrote her other books, I really think Charlotte Bronte was kind of a mean person and a you-know-what at times. I think she was kind of full of herself and a little bit of an egomaniac, and it's very clear when you read this book. So again, it's interesting, but I didn't 100% love it, and I gave it 4 stars, and that's being very, very generous. The next book that I read for Victober was Gothic Tales by Elizabeth Gaskill. Again, this was the group read for this year's Victober. I really enjoyed it. I did not read the whole thing cover to cover. I just read a few of the stories, like The Nurse's Tale and The Poor Clare. That was interesting. It was about a woman and her evil twin and kind of some of the sins of the father, that type of a story. And then I also read Lois the Witch, which was probably my favorite story that I read from this book. Also, between Poor Clare and Lois the Witch, those stories I think averaged out like 200 pages. So I feel I read the most of this book. Lois the Witch in particular was really, really good and very, very interesting and thought-provoking. It's basically about the Salem witch trials. So it's about a young woman named Lois who moves from England after her parents pass away to New England in Massachusetts colonies to live with her uncle and his family. And it's really, really, it just goes from like funny to dark really fast. So basically after her uncle passes away, Lois is just kind of thrown to, you know, the good graces of this family that she really doesn't know, including her aunt, who's kind of jealous and mean to her, her cousin, who is kind of really gross, who she does not like, who's in love with her, and then one of her other girl cousins, who is kind of a backstabber because her kind of boyfriend kind of has a crush on Lois instead of her. Because it's about the Salem witch trials, you know where I'm going with this. The family accuses Lois of being a witch. Very, very, very interesting. And at first when you're reading this, you're thinking, thank God something like that would not happen today. And then you kind of do a double take and be like, wait a minute, it is happening today. Neighbors are turning on neighbors for no apparent reason. People are getting hysterical about a situation that has really no basis in fact. And it's just interesting how just hysteria can run through society and run through a population. And again, we're seeing that today. So when you read this, it's just a very good warning of just to like slow your roll, calm down, don't accuse people of things that you don't know anything about. Really, really enjoyed this. And now that I have an understanding of Elizabeth Gaskill's writing style, I would like to go back at some point and read one of her more full-length novels. I thought she was a very confident writer and very interesting. I really like this one a lot. I don't know how to rate it. I guess I'd give it 4 out of 5 stars based on what I read so far. And the final book that I read for Victober was The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. And this is my second Robert Louis Stevenson after the iconic Treasure Island, of course, which I loved and read for the very first time last year, in fact. And it inspired me to go back and read this very famous story about Dr. Jekyll, the good doctor, and then his evil personality, Mr. Hyde. It was not what I was thinking it was going to be, not what I expected. First of all, it's extremely short. It's only about 100 pages long, so it's more of a short story, I would say, than a full-length novel. This edition by Flame Tree Press also has some of his other stories, The Body Snatchers, things like that. I don't know what I think about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I certainly think that the pop culture has done a better job with the story than the source material. So I think modern movies and TV shows have taken this story and ran with it, and kind of in a better way. They've adapted it in a lot more interesting ways than the source material. That being said, I'm glad I did go back and read it. One thing that annoyed me about it the most, and you'll see this in other Victorian novels that I read this month, especially Tenant of Wildfell Hall, even though I love that book, is I don't know what it was with the Victorians that they had to write stories from the third person perspective in letters and diaries. I have only ever noticed this with Victorian authors. I don't notice it with other classic authors, modern classics, modern authors. I don't know why the Victorians did that, but it kind of gets annoying after a while. And it's especially annoying in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde because the majority of the story is told through a third person's perspective. Mr. Utterson, Dr. Jekyll's lawyer, longtime friend and lawyer. So Mr. Utterson is basically telling the story, and then there's letters, again, diaries that he's reading. And it's just all about the story of his good friend kind of going crazy, and this mysterious stranger, Mr. Hyde, this murderer who kind of shows up in the neighborhood and is always hanging out at Dr. Jekyll's house. And at one point, him and his friends think that he's murdered Dr. Jekyll. It's very interesting. I would say about 80% of it is kind of boring, but that last section where Mr. Utterson is reading the letter from Dr. Jekyll and it's told from Dr. Jekyll's perspective, that's the heart of the story. That's the crux of it. That is why the story is so popular in pop culture, because when Dr. Jekyll tells his story, it's very interesting because you get an idea of the nature of consciousness, of the good side of our nature versus the bad side. So kind of the duality of our personality. So if you love human nature and psychology, I think you will really enjoy this book. Again, it also speaks to the Victorian attitude towards morals and values, also the Victorian attitude towards medicine. I found that fascinating by today's perspective of just how certain drugs can change someone's personality. So again, how that ties back into today's opioid crisis and drug crisis that's going on throughout the world. Very, very cool. And then also just about like the light and dark in all of our characters, and that really we all as human beings have potential for both light and darkness, and it's really about what wolf we feed, right? About what side of our nature that we honor. Really, really enjoyed this one at the end, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I'm glad that I read it, and I think everyone should read it at least once. Thank you everyone for joining me for my Victober wrap up. I had such a fantastic time reading all of these books, especially Tenant of Wildfell Hall. That book just blew my mind. I loved it, and now Anne Bronte is probably kind of inching her way up to be my favorite Bronte sister. I cannot wait to go back and read Agnes Grey now. I love this one so much that I made a Spotify playlist all based on Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Fair warning, it's got a lot of Aretha Franklin on it. That being said though, I really enjoyed reading all these books. It was so much fun, and I'm really looking forward to Nonfiction November now. Thank you everyone, and have a great day.